Now, the first question could be, in your film, you ask a lot of people about how did they meet John Cage and who was John Cage for them. I would like you to answer the same question.
So who was John for me?
And when did you meet him for the first time?
I met John Cage in 1982 after a concert in Frankfurt. And at the time I was desperate to find some sort of guidance, musically mostly, because I was not able, because at the time I was a guitar player, and at the time you could only get into a composition academy if you were in Europe, if you were playing piano and all the classical instruments. So I had gone around and asked many people that they might help me. Anyway, John said that he would, in the sense that he would not teach me, but that he would have a conversation with me. But I had to come to New York for that. So I did. I went to New York. We started a conversation. It was very nice, a simple hour. Had a game of chess, and off I went. And that became something regular. Not very often, once, twice a year. But I would follow him to the concerts in Europe. We'd see each other. And then it developed over time, over a long period of time, it developed into a more serious relationship, more friendly relationship. Beginning then in 1987 with the idea to make a film. That idea was born in Germany on the occasion of again in Frankfurt, on the occasion of the premiere of Europeras.
No, the second question was, in a way, who was John Cage for you?
Yes. John was, I guess, what you would call a lifesaver. A man who had the capability of entrusting you with capabilities. So, for instance, in my work with Stockhausen, it wasn't quite the same. Stockhausen was more of a father figure because he was a very willful, emotional person, but he didn't trust other people that way that John did. For me, that was important. I think I should say it like this. At the time, one of the reasons I think I got involved with people like Stockhausen and Cage, Xenakis, was because I was young, but I was also lacking a father. My father died when I was very young. So there was a personal component in these relationships that these people, Cage, so on, were able to feel. This was different than when I was trying to find work, say at television or with other people that didn't have that personality. And with John, it wasn't personal in the familiar sense, like with Stockhausen, where it was father-son, or with Xenakis was father-son, very strong father. But it was like that in the art, in the music. Unlike the others, he gave me the responsibility to behave musically as a son, shall we say. That, in my work, only expressed itself later. But initially, as myself working as his assistant and then making the film together, it was an expression through trust. He said, let us do this. For instance, as I mentioned in the seminar, it was his last major work. It was his last work. There was one small piece that was composed, it was his last major, 111 was his last major work. And he entrusted me, I was 26, to do this with him, for him, as my first work. I'd never done a film before. I just had this idea that we need to do this, you know? And that is a type of fatherly, artistic trust that made my life. I said before, he saved my life. He made my life artistically because he trusted me with this idea, with the notion that I could do this then and in continuity. It's amazing.
In a way, do you feel that you should continue some his work or his spirit or his...
Oh yeah. My entire artistic career is about continuing his ideas.
And how would you define this continuity?
Yeah. It's, well, as you know, I do two things. I write music and I make these videos. I call them videos, video art, whatever, media art, whatever you want to call it. In both cases, I believe to have found for myself a way of extending, as he has done with the film, of extending his ideas into my world and building upon that. For instance, questions of formation as opposed to composed things in music. In the visuals, the idea of silence, as it's shown at the end of the one film with our performance, has become the beginning image of a whole series. It's now 800 images, of what I call silences. They are images like the first one that we did together, just showing spaces, places, things, people, in the same way that we made 433 in the film, the video of it with him. In the same way, 433, they're not all 433, but it's the idea of 433, that you have one image, moving image, showing something that is inside that you can pay attention to. So if I can just maybe say a word about this. In classic film, narrative film, you have images edited into a narrative, right? Whether it's a documentary, a narrative film, whatever it is. That means that the individual filmed image is never there for itself. It's always there for something else. That's fine as long as it's for something else, but it's not valuable in artistic terms, in modern artistic terms, for itself. It's a part of something else. Now, when I went out to make films, and thanks to John's immediate contribution, I was able to realize that if you take the individual image out of a film context and put it into a different context, like, say, showing it in a museum, then suddenly you're allowed to pay attention to that image just for its own sake. And that is something that actually in film has never been done before. It's a curious phenomenon. You ask yourself, why in 130 years of film history has never anyone showed an individual image for itself? And that's, I think, where I, outside of the question of whether it's good, whether it has quality, whether people like it or not, just in terms of the act of doing it, that's where I have taken John's, how do you say when you run the marathon and you take the stick? I've taken his torch and I'm leading it down the path that I can go for. And the good news is, even if nobody else loves it or likes it, I've been loving this. So and that's why I said, for the last 30 years of my life, I've been having a great time thanks to him. Just giving that church.
Tell me, after 20 years of his death, do you think there's space for new John Cages? Have you ever met someone that you could say, well, he could be a new John Cage? In terms to open a door or a window to allow you to find something really new. Because
yes.
Sometimes it seems that it's very difficult to go further.
Well, I agree with you. I personally think, and I know that you're not going to want to hear this as a aficionado of contemporary music, but to be honest with you, I believe that the spirit of what Cage, but also that generation, Stockhausen, Ligeti, Zanag, the big guys, the spirit of what they did led to an end of contemporary music as we know it. But what it did do, it opened up to the mainstream. So you have, this is my opinion, you have people working in other areas that are doing very interesting things. For instance, in what we call world music. Suddenly we're paying attention to composers from elsewhere. that are doing surprising things. I'm not saying that there's immediately John Cage is a huge figure in 20th century art. I don't know what to say about that, because that is a question of time and perception. But in terms of his work dissipating into the mainstream, into other places, you have all sorts of interesting phenomena which will then prove themselves. If you listen to a record by Prince, for instance, there is so much Cage inside of that. I know for a fact these people listen to that. I once spoke to a wonderful musician, Maurice White, Earth, Wind and Fire. Now this is a funk band, right? They all use Cajun idioms. It's so inside the mainstream of music. What I mean to say by that is that a type of new genius, shall we say, in my view, is going to come out of an area that we're not anticipating. It could be anywhere. It could be out of, for instance, I know some sound designers in Hollywood that are purely amazing. The way that they treat sound, it's unheard of.
But always out of the classical music.
That's my impression right now.
Because in a way, it is belonging to the classical.
I think, interesting point. For instance, Frank Zappa, a man that I worked for a long time. I believe that he is a great follower or heir to Cage. Unfortunately, his scores are not properly published yet. But here's a man who looked at the compositional landscape of the generation in front of him, and he came to a very interesting conclusion, and that is that personal style dictates the music. Interesting, because Cage didn't like that, but the result is interesting nonetheless. So what Zappa found out, and I think he's the first one in music history to do this, is to say, I, as a composer, I'm going to take all of the musical material that is out there in the world, and I'm going to do something with it. That's a Cage idea. But he does it by saying, I have a personality, a musical personality, a musical expression, and I'm going to use that to define a world of music that is mine. So suddenly you have, if you listen to Zappa's records carefully, as you do, you'll see there's a big band record, there's a classical record with orchestra, there's all sorts of different styles, there's even a folk album, there's electronica, there's everything. He's well known as a rock musician, right? But as a composer, he has gone into, like Cage, into every idea possible. Samples. Zappa was, early 90s before he died, at the forefront of all of that, doing things that Cage would have loved to do if he'd been a bit younger, And I think that for a composer like Zappa to say, I'm taking the influence of Cage and I'm changing it into I'm putting it further. I think, so to answer your question, I think probably in my world, Zappa would be the right heir to the Cage in terms of music and in terms of significance also. I need to say that in my world, I look at Cage as the great embracer of everything that is sonic and more. And then there's Zappa who says, now what are we going to do with that? So give you an example. This is an example that Frank used. Cage would incorporate, as in 433, all the sounds that exist. And he didn't make value judgments. Now Zappa will do the same thing, but make value judgments. So he'll say, all right, it's one thing to open up music for sound and noise and whatever else there is, but now what do you do with it? What does it mean? And he used the example of saying, what does it mean to play on a piano, a C major chord, and break glass or kick a bucket? you know, or have somebody scream or have a siren go, which is exactly what Cage did. But now you go a step further and organize that again as if it was written music. And then what does that mean? I mean, not that Cage didn't do that, but in the sense of asking questions about the psychoacoustics of composition. So Cage was about understanding the world of sound. And Zappa, in my world, is about the psychoacoustics of sound. So what do you do with the material once everything is available?